Chapter 1. The Castaways. Alexander Hamilton claimed Nevis in the British West Indies as his birthplace, although no surviving records substantiate this. Today, the tiny island seems more than a colorful speck in the Caribbean, an exotic tourist hideaway. 1 million years ago, the land that is now Nevis Peak thrust up from the seafloor to form the island, and the extinct volcanic cone still intercepts the trade winds at an altitude of 3,200 feet, its jagged peak often obscured behind a thick swirl of clouds. This omnipresent mountain looming over the jungles, plunging gorges, and verdant foothills that sweep down to sandy beaches made the island a natural fortress for the British. It abounded in both natural wonders and horrors. In 1690, the first capital, Jamestown, was swallowed whole by the sea during an earthquake and tidal wave. To modern eyes, Nevis may seem like a sleepy backwater to which Hamilton was confined before his momentous escape to St. Croix and North America. But if we adjust our vision to 18th century realities, we see that this West Indian setting was far from marginal. The crossroads of a bitter maritime rivalry among European powers vying for the mastery of the lucrative sugar trade. A small revolution in consumer tastes had turned the Caribbean into prized acreage, for growing sugarcane to sweeten the coffee, tea, and cocoa imbibed in fashionable European capitals. As a result, the small scattered islands generated more wealth for Britain than all of her North American colonies combined. The West Indians vastly outweigh us of the northern colonies, Benjamin Franklin grumbled in the 1760s. After the French and Indian War, the British vacillated about whether to swap up all of Canada for the island of Guadeloupe. In the event of the French toasted their diplomatic cunning in retaining the sugar island, the sudden popularity of sugar, dubbed white gold, engendered a brutal world of overnight fortunes in which slavery proved indispensable. Since indigenous Caribbeans and Europeans balked at toiling in the sweltering cane brakes, thousands of blacks were shipped from slave trading forts in West Africa to cultivate Nevis and the neighboring islands. British authorities colonized Nevis with vagabonds, criminals, and other riffraff swept from the London streets to work as indentured servants or overseers. In 1727, the minister of a local Anglican church, aching for some glimmer of spirituality, regretted that the slaves were inclined to laziness, stealing, stubbornness, murmuring, treachery, lying, drunkenness, and the like. But he reserved his most scathing strictures for a rowdy white populace composed of whole shiploads of pickpockets, whores, rogues, vagrants, thieves, sodomites, and other filth and cutthroats of society. Trapped in this beautiful but godless spot, the minister bemoaned that the British imports were not bad enough for the gallows, and yet too bad to live among their virtuous countrymen at home. While other founding fathers were reared in tidy New England villages or cosseted on the baronial Virginia estates, Hamilton grew up in a tropical hellhole of dissipated whites and fractious slaves, all framed by a backdrop of luxuriant natural beauty. On both his maternal and paternal sides, Hamilton's family clung to the insecure middle rung of West Indian life. Squeezed between plantation aristocrats above and street rabble and unruly slaves below, taunted as a bastard throughout his life, Hamilton was understandably reluctant to chat about his childhood. "My birth is the subject of the most humiliating criticism," he wrote in one pained confession, and he turned his early family history into a taboo topic, alluded to in only a couple of cryptic letters. He described his maternal grandfather, the physical John Fawcett, as a French Huguenot who emigrated to the West Indies in consequence of the revocation of the Edict of Nantes and settled in the island of Nevis and there acquired a pretty fortune, revoked in 1685 by Louis XIV, and the Edict of Nantes had guaranteed religious toleration for French Protestants. I have been assured by persons who knew him that he was a man of letters and much of a gentleman. Born 10 years later, after his grandfather's death, Hamilton may have embellished the sketch with a touch of gentility. In the slave-based economy, physicians often attended the auctions, checking the teeth of the human chattel and making them run, leap, and jump to test whatever strength remained after the grueling middle passage. No white in the Sugar Islands was entirely exempt from the pervasive taint of slavery. The archives of St. George's Parish in the fertile, mountainous Gingerland section of Nevis record the marriage of John Fawcett to a British woman, Mary Uppington, on August 21st, 1718. By that point, they already had 2 children, a daughter Anne and a son John, the latter arriving 2 months before the wedding, in all likelihood, lulled by the casual mores of the tropics. The Fawcetts decided to formalize their link after the birth of their second child, having lived until then as a common-law couple, an expedite adopted by Hamilton's own parents. In all, the Fawcetts produced 7 children, Hamilton's mother, Rachel, being the second youngest, born circa 1729. A persistent mythology in the Caribbean asserts that Rachel was partly black, making Alexander Hamilton a quadroon, or an octoroon. In this obsessively race-conscious society, however, Rachel was invariably listed among the whites on local tax rolls. Her identification of someone of mixed race has no basis in the verifiable fact. The folklore that Hamilton was mulatto probably arose from the incontestable truth that many, but not most, illegitimate children in the West Indies bore mixed blood. At the time of Rachel's birth, the 4,000 slaves on Nevis outnumbered the whites by a ratio of 4 to 1, making inequitable carnal relations between black slaves and white masters a dreadful commonplace. Occupying a house in the southern Nevis foothills, the Fawcetts owned a small sugar plantation and had at least 7 slaves, pretty typical for the petite bourgeoisie. That Nevis later had a small black village named Fawcett. An angelicized version of the family name confirms their ownership of slaves who later consumed their surname. The Sugar Islands were visited so regularly by epidemics of almost biblical proportions, malaria, dysentery, and yellow fever being the worst offenders, that 5 Fawcett children perished in infancy or childhood, leaving only Rachel and her much older sister Anne as survivors. Even aided by slaves, small planters found it a tough existence. Skirting the volcanic cone, the Nevis hills were so steep and rocky, even when terraced, they proved troublesome for sugar cultivation. The island steadily lost its economic eminence, especially after a mysterious plant disease, aggravated by drought, slowly crept across Nevis in 1737 and denuded it of much of its lush vegetation. This prompted a mass exodus of refugees, including Anne Fawcett, who had married a well-to-do planter named James Lytton. They camped to the Danish islands of St. Croix, charting an escape route that Hamilton's parents were to follow. Evidence indicates that the Fawcett marriage was marred by perpetual squabbling, perhaps compounded by the back-to-back deaths of 2 of their children in 1736, and the blight that parched the island the next year. Mary Fawcett was a pretty, socially ambitious woman, and probably not content to dawdle on a stagnant island. Determined and resourceful, with a clear knack for cultivating powerful men, she appealed to the Chancellor of the Leeward Islands for a legal separation from her husband. In the 1740 settlement, the Fawcetts agreed to live separately and apart for the rest of their lives, and Mary renounced all rights to her husband's property in exchange for an inadequate annuity of £53. It is possible that she and Rachel traversed the narrow 2-mile strait to St. Kitts, where they may even have first encountered a young Scottish nobleman named James Hamilton. Because her mother had surrendered all claims to John Fawcett's money, 16-year-old Rachel Fawcett achieved the sudden glow of a minor heiress in 1745, when her father died and left her all of his property. Since Rachel was bright, beautiful, and strong-willed, traits we can deduce from subsequent events, she must have been hotly pursued in a world chronically deficient in well-heeled, educated European women. Rachel and her mother decided to start anew on St. Croix, where James and Anne Leyden had prospered, building a substantial estate outside the capital, Christiansted, called the Grange. The Leydens likely introduced themselves to another newcomer from Nevis, a Dane named Johann Michael Lavian, who had peddled household goods and now aspired to planter status. The name Lavian can be a Sephardic variant of Levine, but if he was Jewish, he managed to conceal his origins. Because he presented himself as a Jew, the snobbish Mary Fawcett would certainly have squelched the match in a world that frowned on religious, no less than interracial marriage. From fragmentary evidence, Lavian emerges as a man who dreamed of plucking sudden riches from the New World but stumbled like others into multiple disappointments. The year before he met Rachel, he squandered so much of his paltry capital on a minor St. Croix sugar plantation. On this island of grand estates, a profitable operation required 50 to 100 slaves, something beyond the reveries of the thinly capitalized Lavian. He then lowered his sights appreciably and, trying to become a planter of the cheap, acquired a 50% stake on a small cotton plantation. He ended up deeply in hock to the Danish West India and Guinea Company. Beyond her apparent physical allure, Rachel Fawcett must have represented a fresh source of ready cash for Lavian. For Alexander Hamilton, Johann Michael Lavian was the certified ogre of his family saga. He wrote, "A Dane, a fortune hunter of the name Levine," Hamilton's spelling, came to Nevis bedizened with gold and paid his addresses to my mother, then a handsome young woman, having a snug fortune. In the 18th century, a snug fortune signified one sufficient for a comparatively easy life. Partial to black silk gowns and blue vests with bright gold buttons, Lavian was a flashy dresser and must have splurged on such finery to hide his threadbare budget and palm himself off on Mary Fawcett as an affluent suitor. Hamilton rued the day that his grandmother was captivated by the glitter of Lavian's appearance and auctioned her daughters off, as it were, to the highest bidder. In compliance with the wishes of her mother, but against her own inclination, Hamilton stated, the 16-year-old Rachel agreed to marry the older Lavian, her senior by at least a dozen years. In Hamilton's blunt estimation, it was a hated marriage, as the daughter of one unhappy union was thrust straight into another. In 1745, the ill-fated wedding took place at the Grange. The newlyweds set up house on their own modest plantation, which was named, with macabre irony, Contentment. The following year, the teenage bride gave birth to a son, Peter, destined to be her one legitimate child. One wonders if Rachel ever submitted to further conjugal relations with Lavian. Even if Lavian was not the coarse man of repulsive personality evoked by Hamilton's grandson, it seems clear that Rachel felt stifled by her older husband, finding him crude and insufferable. In 1748, Lavian bought a half share in another small sugar plantation, enlarging his debt and frittering away Rachel's fast-dwindling inheritance. The marriage deteriorated at the point where the headstrong's wife simply abandoned the house around 1750. A vindictive Lavian ranted in a subsequent divorce decree that while Rachel had lived with him, she had committed such errors as which between husband and wife were indecent and very suspicious. In his severe judgment, she was shameless, coarse, and ungodly. Enraged, his pride bruised, Lavian was determined to humiliate his unruly bride, seizing on a Danish law that allowed a husband to jail his wife if she was twice found guilty of adultery and no longer resided with him. He had Rachel clapped into the dreaded Christian Svern. the Christianstead Fort, which did double duty as the town jail. Rachel has sometimes been portrayed as a prostitute. One of Hamilton's journalistic nemesis branded him the son of a camp girl. But such insinuations were absurd. On the other hand, that Lavian broadcast his accusations against her and met no outright refutation means that Rachel had indeed flouted social convention and found solace in the arms of another man. Perched on the edge of Gallows Bay, Fort Christiansvern had a cannon that could be trained on pirates or enemy ships crossing the coral reef, as well as smaller artillery that could be swiveled landward and used to suppress slave insurrections. In this ghastly place, unspeakable punishments were meted out to rebellious blacks who had committed heinous crimes, striking whites, touching cane fields, or dashing off to freedom. They could be whipped, branded, and castrated, shackled with heavy leg irons, and entombed in filthy dungeons. The remaining cells tended to be populated by town drunks, petty thieves, and the other dregs of white society. It seems that no woman other than Rachel Lavian was ever imprisoned there for adultery. Rachel spent several months in a dank, cramped cell that measured 10 by 13 feet, and she must have gone through infernal torments of fear and loneliness. Through a small, deeply inset window, she would stare across sharpened spikes that encircled the outer wall, and gaze at blue-green water that sparkled in fierce tropical sunlight. She could also eavesdrop on the busy wharf, stacked with hogsheads of sugar, which her son Alexander would someday frequent as a young clerk in a trading firm. All the while, she had to choke down a nauseating diet of salted herring codfish and boiled yellow cornmeal mush. As an amateur psychologist, Lavian left something to be desired, for he imagined that when Rachel was released after 3 to 5 months, this broken woman would now tamely submit to her autocratic rule, that everything would be better, and that she would, like a true wife, would have changed her ungodly mode of life, and would live with him as was meet and fitting, as the divorce decree later proclaimed. He had not reckoned on her invincible spirit. Solitude had only stiffened her resolve to expel Lavian from her life, as Hamilton later philosophized in another text. It is only to consult our own hearts to be convinced that nations like individuals revolt at the idea of being guided by external compulsion. After Rachel left the fort, she spent a week with her mother, who was living in one of St. Croix's overlord's town, Captain Bertram Pieter de Neuilly, supporting herself by sewing and renting out her 3 slaves. Then Rachel did something brave but reckless that sealed her future status as a pariah. She fled the island, abandoning both Lavian and her sole son Peter. In doing so, she relinquished the future benefits of a legal separation and inadvertently doomed the unborn Alexander to illegitimacy. In her proud defiance of persecution, her mental toughness, and her willingness to court controversy, it is hard not to see a startling preview of her son's passionately willful behavior. When she left for St. Kitts in 1750, Rachel seems to have been accompanied by her mother, who announced her departure to creditors in a newspaper notice and settled her debts. Rachel must have imagined that she would never again set eyes on St. Croix, and that the vengeful Lavian had inflicted his final lash. Alexander Hamilton may have been musing upon his mother's marriage to Lavian when he later observed, "'Tis a very good thing when their stars unite 2 people who are fit for each other, but who have souls capable of relishing the sweets of friendship and sensibilities. But it's a dog of a life when 2 dissonant tempers meet." When the time came for choosing his own wife, he would proceed with special care. Hamilton's other star-crossed parent, James Hamilton, had also been bedeviled by misfortune on the islands. Born around 1718, he was the 4th of 11 children, 9 sons, 2 daughters. Of Alexander Hamilton, the Laird of Grange in Stevenson Parish in Ayrshire, Scotland, the southwest of Glasgow. In 1711, that Alexander Hamilton, the 14th Laird, and the so-called Cambus Keith, line of Hamiltons, married Elizabeth Pollock, the daughter of a baronet. As Alexander must have heard ad nauseam in his boyhood, the Cambus Keith Hamiltons possessed a coat of arms and for centuries had owned a castle near Kilmarnock called the Grange. Indeed, that lineage can be traced back to the 14th century in impeccable genealogical tables, and he boasted in later years that he was the scion of a blue ribbon Scottish family. The truth is that, on the question who my parents were, I have better pretensions than most of those who in this century can plume themselves on ancestry.